it's great to be a designer or IT field right now because there's no shortage of opportunities. And I think it's also more egalitarian in the sense that if you're in a small town in the USA, even though you were talented, but if you weren't willing to move, Apple, Google, they weren't willing to, or Facebook, they weren't willing to hire you unless you moved to, say, Menlo Park or Cupertino or the Bay Area. And now you can.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Design Adjacent, the podcast that talks about the nexus of design, both today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Benny F. Johnson, and today our guest is none other than Pek Pongpaet, CEO of Impekable, an award-winning digital product agency specializing in UI, UX design, mobile app development, and web development. Pek is a noted entrepreneur and speaker on the topics of innovation, design, product, and the impact of design on business. So today I'd like to welcome him as entrepreneur, futurist, and problem solver. Welcome, Pek.
Thank you, Benny, for having me on the show. You have such a great voice for podcasts. This is amazing. So I wish I had your voice because I sound like a child sometimes. People have a hard time taking me seriously. And so it's good to have a nice voice. And congrats on your 2-year mark at AIGA.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words and opening laugh. You too have a great podcast that you've been working on. One of the things that we've been exploring in this space of design adjacent are the ways in which we all come to design. Many of us didn't start off thinking that we were designers, taking on that name or mantle, but just thinking about the journey. I'd love to ask you, how did you end up coming to run an agency that really is driven by design?
That's a great story to tell. I studied computer engineering when I think, a lot of Asians have that pressure of, doctor, lawyer, engineer, the 3 career options, right? So I'm originally from Thailand. And at first I was open to medicine. And so my career could have gone very differently, very, very, in a parallel multiverse dimension. There's like a Dr. Pek somewhere. But in this universe, I pursued engineering first. And so that's kind of where I went. I grew up late in life in junior high school. I was exposed to computers in the 80s, and I was very intrigued by computers, whether it's playing games or the applications like paint programs and writing small applications. So I thought, okay, this is something interesting. It's new. It intrigues me, the computer. And I thought I'd go to school for computer engineering. At the time, I didn't realize that I would really love the software side. So computer engineering was at the time at UIC they didn't have a dedicated computer engineering degree. It was half part electrical engineering, half part computer science. Yeah. And I later discovered that I really did not care much for hardware, but I really loved the software piece. So fast forward, I have a computer engineering degree. My first job, I write software out of the gate. And that was my career for the first several years. And I was in a consulting company as a consulting firm that sponsored my green card. And then over time, over different clients, varying degrees, sometimes the clients would be smaller at this firm. And you kind of had to touch wear many hats. So not just write code. It's like, oh, okay. You also had to write front end code, or you had to convert designs to code. Oh, well, this design needs a little tweaking. Hey, Pek, can you go into Photoshop and just change the design a little bit? So I got more and more exposed to this. And so I was exposed to design in my software career. But what was really the catalyst was, I think around the time when Steve Jobs came back to Apple and Mac software started to get better. And then also this explosion of the first .com, where there was a lot of consumer internet products that were well designed or started to get well designed. So companies like Facebook, Google, products like Hotmail or PayPal that had really good user experiences. And that's when I started thinking, well, if all things being equal, the software works, what pulled me towards certain applications, certain pieces of software was how well they were designed and how thoughtful they were from a user experience perspective. And even that word maybe didn't really exist quite yet in the context. And people just thought, oh, it was well designed. So that kind of intrigued me. And then at that time, around that time, my company, I was at Accenture then. My company sent me a budget for going to conferences. So one year I picked to go into Adobe Max Conference. And I was just blown away by the work that some of these sessions had that people were doing. And that really solidified my interest in user experience design. So after that, I shifted doing less software development work and more product design work, or I started self-teaching. I started just trying to own more of that work in my career instead of just writing code on the back end. And so over time, gradually people stopped paying me to write code and people started paying me to design. So it was a gradual transition, kind of like a frog in boiling water.
So it's interesting how you started to talk about self-teaching and creating a space, and you can hear in your words kind of the agency. You started grabbing for more of that work. To describe a bit of that feeling, what led you to do that?
Well, there was a couple feelings. One, I was very enamored of tech software and the startup ecosystem. So companies like Google and Yahoo and other notables, and Facebook to a certain extent. And the ability to create software, but not only write it, but I think designing it holistically brings that software to life. So if you can only code, you might hack together something that, people might not enjoy using. And then if you can only design, then it kind of ends there unless you can find a developer. But by being able to do both, you are able to bring your vision to life. And so I started doing that. Well, I always had in the back of my mind, I wanted to build software. My vision for myself was to try to have a software product at some point. And I've even dabbled in that. I would say in the early days when I didn't have marketing or sales skills, a lot of what I built were little products, little projects, I would say. So like I would call them little toys. So like a bookmarking app, for example, or sort of like a Twitter bot game, or like a search engine for books. So build little toys like that, consumer applications, because that was what I was enamored with. I think now as a more mature person and a seasoned person, I think now I've come to realize where the money is are B2B SaaS.
But it's definitely where the business is. But I think what you explored is where the innovation starts with this kind of referring to it as toys. You get in the mindset of play.
Yes.
The power of play in problem solving. And problem solving is really at the central part of whether it's UX, UI design, 2D design, we're all coming back to solving problems. And so I think one of the problems you jumped into is you spent time working with others and working for others, but then you decided to take a leap to start your own firm. Talk a little bit about how and why, and what problems did you think you could solve?
Sure. So I moved to the Bay Area after about a decade and a half of working in Chicago. I decided, okay, I wanted to move to the Bay Area and see what all the fuss is about and kind of see where where all the action is in terms of startups and tech and design, consumer internet design at least. And so I moved out there. I actually originally wanted to start a software company, like a software product company. And my co-founder and I at the time iterated on a few things, but we just didn't have all the chops that are needed, and we never found product market fit. So we weren't successful in our initial endeavor. So we amicably parted ways. But then I started exploring what I was good at, and maybe not knowing about the concept then, but being more familiar with the concept now of Ikigai, where there's what the market needs, what you're good at, what brings you joy, what people are willing to pay you for. I found the service of providing software design. I was naturally good at it. I had been doing the craft for many years, and being in the market in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, there was definitely a lot of need for an appetite for good UX. So I quickly, started as a freelancer I was able to find many interesting clients. And more, they needed more services. They needed more hours, more bandwidth. So I quickly realized that as a solo freelancer developer, designer, that wasn't going to scale very well other than working myself to death. So I quickly hired some help, and that organically grew into what is now Impekable. Is, we've realized that this is a workable model. We can build a team, we can grow the talent in-house, combine that with hiring outside talent, seasoned talent. And then there's enough work here and relationships to make it a viable business.
In making that transition and kind of understanding your own skill set, what are some of the first lessons that you learned of moving from the individual contributor, kind of freelance army of one, to now creating your own agency that's dynamic? What are some of the lessons?
Absolutely. And this is something that I think people who want to get to that transition need to be real with themselves. Is you have to learn how to sell. I think people take for granted when you take a paycheck, right? That somehow just magically shows up every month into your bank account. When you have your own company, that's not guaranteed, right? You gotta go hunt for it, or you have a business partner who that's what they do, right? That's what they're good at. And whether that's through sales or marketing, it really doesn't matter. You have to have that, one or the other, ideally both. And then as you scale from the individual to more people, I had to learn how to manage people, direct traffic, and mentor them. There's a couple of ways to start and grow a company. One, you just hired much more senior, seasoned people than you. And of course, that takes money. So you can do it that way. And I know several agency owners who had immediately started with very senior talent. Or you can do what I did, where I couldn't afford that. So especially in the Bay Area where salaries are so high, I hired interns and junior talent, and then I mentored them. I was a decent enough designer because people hired me. So I mentored and coached and grew a small initial design team in-house. So mentoring and coaching, and then also being able to delegate that work, being able to manage them and making sure that they're doing the work and scaling that way. And then also, I would say having some business acumen around, keeping the books and administrative stuff is always helpful. Some of that you can outsource, but I think, the more you have some awareness of that, I think it's only does serve you good.
I wanted to take a moment to this because this is really incredible advice. And what we've seen in the market research we've done over the last year and a half or so is that a really large percentage, somewhere in the neighborhood of 81% of designers will eventually go out and have their own practice. And we often think about the work and the dynamism, what we're going to do, but it's the part that you're talking about. How am I going to staff? How am I going to spread the work? How am I going to scale? That we often don't spend a lot of time digging into. And that really is kind of make or break of our dreams and the reality of running our own enterprise, right? So
yes,
when you think about that and you talk a bit about mentorship, one of the things that really struck me was a piece that you wrote for LinkedIn last year that talked about your own journey as a leader. And I'm going to paraphrase, but you talked about this being one of the toughest times ever as a CEO. And so talk a little bit about that. I mean, you really kind of opened up to share that experience of we were all living our own kind of pains in the space the last 18 months of the pandemic, but you wrote about why this was a tough time as a CEO.
Yeah. Well, I wrote that piece during the initial throes of the pandemic. And I think social media is this thing now where you project this certain image of yourself, and it's always maybe like the shiny, happy. I wouldn't say necessarily fake. It's true, but it's only one aspect, right? And people don't show the struggle, the hustle, like the difficulties, but they only want to show the victories, right? And I'm just as guilty of this pre-pandemic. I think, the awards, the testimonials, the accolades, the logos. Of course, we're happy to talk about these things. but it makes people feel like, well, one, it's not healthy for other people. I think studies have shown social media has that impact because you look at other people and like, oh, wow, that their life is so perfect. And a lot of people may have an image of Impekable, when they see our website and our work, they may think, oh, this company's going so great, have it all together. But I think, sometimes it's useful to share how the sausage is made, if you will, or kind of the reality, just like when some Instagram influencers show the here's the perfect shot, and then here's the reality of what it took to get that shot. I was trying to do the same. And, I knew also that many people during COVID, many businesses were struggling. And I didn't want to just continue that cycle of, oh, rah, rah, we're all doing good. When there's a sort of this thing in the Bay Area where people ask how you're doing. It's like, oh yeah, we're killing it. And even though you're not, right? And it's this fake it till you make it sometimes. So I wanted to express what I was really going through. And actually what I received a lot of comments regarding, hey, thank you because I don't feel so alone. Hey, I'm going through some hard times too. And it was great to hear that everybody's going through this. So I was in a way trying to do my part in normalizing that it's okay that it's tough right now, because it is tough right now. Yeah, a lot of companies were not sure how to handle this. And the way they handled it was to hit a pause button on everything. For many of our clients, they didn't know how to react. So there's like, let's just pause on what we're doing. And in the meantime, you're trying to keep payroll, trying to hold on to your people. So you don't know how long this pause is going to go. And so you're starting to stress out as your bank account is dwindling. So it was a very stressful time. And that's why, I wanted to share that.
I thank you for that. And, really kind of said, I come back to the words, this is probably one of the hardest times that I'm going through as a CEO. And you said before, people don't often realize that there are struggles at each level you have in your career space in there. You talked a bit about mentoring your staff. As you've grown as an entrepreneur and a CEO, who have you been able to look to as kind of mentors or examples?
That's a great question. I love that question. Well, mentorship can take many forms. I've done several things. One, as someone who never went to business school or MBA school or done any real form of sales training, I had to learn these skills and business. One type of mentor I turned to was books. So reading from past successful entrepreneurs and founders. So reading Sam Walton's biography, Arnold Schwarzenegger's biography, Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. So there's a lot of successful people who have biographies or autobiographies. I think their lessons and stories are great learning lessons that you don't have to have that connection with them, right? Like nobody that I just mentioned know who I am, but by virtue of them having their book published, we can learn from them. So that's one. And then also, of course, your people in your network that have done it before, try to nurture and curate that network of yours. So even now, I keep in my company an inordinate amount of people in the agency world or other agency owners. It's sort of friendly. I have a funny term I call them frenemies, even though I don't really think they're competitors. I don't think we compete in any way in the sense that any more than an Italian restaurant in Chicago competes with an Italian restaurant in DC, or even the same Italian restaurants in the same city. I think people have their preferences, right? So it's good to have that network because one, they can relate to you. They've been through your journey or are going through your journey. So having a peer group of people doing similar things. So if you're an agency owner, it behooves you to know agency owners, or even agency owners who are maybe a step above you, who are, where you want to be. And then and this is something that it's in the past couple years is actual coaches. So business coaches and these type of things. If you think about when I was learning piano, I took piano lessons from someone. When I was learning tennis, I took tennis lessons from someone. But the thing that has the most financial risk versus reward, people are going to figure it themselves out on their own and bang their head against the wall makes no sense, right? So now looking back on it, it's like, well, I think everybody should try to get a business coach. Just like you wouldn't ever think of learning tennis by yourself or martial. Like I used to live and practice martial arts very seriously. And I can't even imagine self-teaching martial arts. You never get good. You get a good martial arts coach or instructor, find a good school. So if you want to open a design agency, build a startup, you get a coach who's done that before versus trying to do it on your own.
And as you grow, your engagement with your coaching infrastructure grows, right? Because you think about it,
right?
If you're a novice in anything, the type of coach that you have is very different as you increase and the stakes get higher and you increase more success and more skill. I was going to ask you about that. One of the quotes, we were talking about your love of quotes earlier, that in that article and piece, I was going to save this for the end, but since you brought up your time studying martial arts, the quote that you have that really kind of sings out was, don't pray for an easy life. Pray for the strength to endure the difficult one. It's a quote attributed to Bruce Lee. And, this was at the heart of your piece about pushing as a CEO. What other quotes would you have to encourage your team? What are some of your kind of the quotes that really come back and resonate with you?
That's a tough one. One is, it's about growth. This is one. Man cannot remake himself without suffering, for he is both the marble and the sculptor. That's a good one. A lot of growth is pain and suffering, and that's when you grow. If you're always in your comfort zone, and this is true whether it's in sports, I think you feel it physically in sports, right? Like if you only do what you're comfortable with, you never feel the pain. You're never pushing yourself. You're never sweating. It's hard to grow, whether it's muscle or endurance or anything you're working towards in sports. But, if you're sculpting yourself, if you're a bodybuilder, it's quite literal. But if you're sculpting yourself to become a better athlete, better thing like that, you're going to go through some hard training and they'll grow you. In the same way, I think the journey of whether it's someone's career, if you're always in your comfort zone, if you only do what you already know, then you're not growing. But by definition, when you do something you don't know, well, one, you're going to feel uncomfortable. Two, you may fail. So those are all suffering. But in order to grow, you don't have that certainty that you're going to fail or succeed. So whether that's your career or an enterprise, like building your own business, or even just take it down to a micro level of a project, right? So like a project, you might take certain risks if you always play it safe and you're going to get certain parameters. But if you want to, the very definition of risk versus reward, right? Like the reward could be outsized if you take a little bit of risk, right? Some risk, but risk also implies going outside your comfort zone, going outside known things, having all the information. And of course, you want to take calculated risks. You don't want to suffer taking that quote, right? If you suffer in the way that you can't recover, then you're destroying your marble, right? Like your sculpture. So you don't want to destroy the sculpture. You want to chip away at it in a safe way. Yeah.
So, we talk about presence and taking up space, both as a leader and as a part of the team. We talked about it kind of philosophically, but in a physical sense, what's been interesting is your organization, you started really as a distributed model from the start, which many organizations today are now kind of adopting as the new normal. But you were an organization that really defied where you had to be at any general time. Talk a bit about what lessons you've learned working the last few years with a team that's been distributed, and how do you think that can inform companies going forward?
We were fortunate that we were pre-pandemic mostly remote. We did have a small Bay Area office. So in a sense, we also sort of had a double culture. We had a small office, so there was some in-office presence. And I would say even my personal experience was mostly, if we talk about Pek, the employee, he had a mostly in-office experience, but also like you, very travel heavy. The traveling salesman, go to conferences, go to meet clients face to face in the Bay Area, go travel, get on a plane to meet a client. And so that was my personal experience. But at the same time, why we were a remote company in the first place was, well, it would have been hard to support a 100% Bay Area team financially. The economics wouldn't work. So we always had a distributed team to make it work as an agency financially. So we had to learn how to work remotely pre-pandemic, which was nice because by the time the pandemic came along, it was business as usual for us, frankly, because we already figured it out how to work remotely. And some of those lessons are, I think, for companies that had a very office heavy presence, I think they tend to communicate a lot more orally, kind of like the tap over the shoulder, kind of walk by and then, hey, by the way, I need this and that versus, or come to your cubicle type way of working. Whereas I think in a purely remote work world, you have to optimize for online communication and then also take this to the next level when your team is not even in the same time zone. You have to learn how to communicate well asynchronously. What might work in like short phrases or short form communication where somebody who is unclear might ask a question because it's unclear. Well, if you're 12 hours apart, you don't have that luxury unless you want to stretch out that conversation over several days. You want to be very clear. You want to have be more well thought out so that your communication is succinct and that people don't have any questions, or you reduce the churn, right? If you answer in short phrases, well, that conversation might end up taking days because you don't have the luxury of being in the same time like before, or even in the same presence. So I think for companies that are trying to become more remote friendly, over indexing on documentation, communication, and think of asynchronous first, then also I think it's very easy for companies that kind of had in office culture and then you're either in or out in the sense that maybe some people were kind of out of the loop because the people in the office had more communication density, or it was just a more high definition, we'll call it, right? Versus, everybody kind of is in the conference room, they hash it all out, and then they'll tell the person who's remote what went on in the, in the meeting. And by being remote first, I think you have to work on that inclusion, be much more inclusive. I mean, you're the CEO who's remote, right? Like the rest of the office is in New York or maybe concentrated in New York and you're in DC. So you have to figure out ways to be inclusive. Otherwise the CEO is excluded.
It is. It's a new way of approaching our world, but really not new at all. If we think about kind of one of the things that we tried to do beforehand was be really intentional about our structures and our engagement. And we find that intentionality serves you well as you make these transitions, as you make these kind of new spaces. I thought it was interesting. You referred to at the beginning of having like a double culture. And so, you're talking about really practical ways to mitigate the downside of the double culture. Have you seen, as your team lives and breathes this distributed model, have you seen any additional plus sides to this culture dynamic?
It's more egalitarian in the sense that if you had an office and a remote culture, kind of what we were doing before, I always felt like sometimes there was a double culture in the sense that, the people in the office had more face time with me, for better or for worse, right? I'm not saying they just by being in the same office as me, like if there was a slow day, we might all go out to lunch together. If it was a slow afternoon, we might all take a coffee break and go walk to the nearest. We were in downtown San Jose, so we might go and have a coffee break. And that was not something I always felt like that was great for the employees here. And it was great for me to be able to have that relationship with the local employees, but it was also at a disadvantage if you weren't. And I didn't know how to course correct for that, other than, this was again pre-pandemic when people came in. So we would often try to, like, several times a year would fly our remote employees in so they could spend some time with the rest of the team and also with me. How I would course correct that was I would set aside the whole week and I sort of showered them with attention to try to make up for all the time I didn't get to spend with them. So that was kind of my way of doing it. But again, it can only go so far, right? But now I think we have a culture like this last summer. I had mentioned that, we used to do like a summer barbecue. We should get, I don't know how we do one now, right? And we had a concentration of folks, say in Chicago, and I was thinking, okay, maybe we could do like a Chicago one. Then, we got to talk with our people team a bit more. And, yes, that's great that I think like that. But maybe what's better and more inclusive is what if we had barbecue for everyone where people could just do, like we gave a budget and people could order their barbecue from DoorDash or Yelp or whatever, Uber Eats. So we gave some money. So then we all had a barbecue together over Zoom. And same with Halloween. So we ended up having like a Halloween costume contest over Zoom. So on Halloween day, we came into work dressed up in our costumes, including myself. And you hop on all these Zoom calls for work and everybody's in costume. So that was kind of fun. Yeah. So I think you just adapt. People are, what is that Darwin quote, right? It's not the strongest that survive, but it's the most adaptable to change. And in this new environment, all I can say is, the ones that can adapt to this new environment will survive and thrive.
In terms of new environment, if you can speak to it. Have you noticed any changes in the type of work that's coming in that over the last few months? Has there been a change in the way in which your clients are coming to you or asking for your problem solving skills?
I think the industry trend that we're all seeing is it's accelerating. This pandemic is accelerating digital transformation at an alarming, this pandemic has done more than CIOs have tried to do in 10 years because it's sort of a forcing function. So I think that's what we're seeing as a trend is more shift towards digital. And because of that, there's more investment in digital, so technology, but also technology services. So smaller companies, of course, will still prefer to buy rather than build. But bigger companies who care about user experience want and are behind on their digital transformation journey, or maybe some of the projects have been on the back burner, are all now accelerating that because they need it now, because their retail presence is really suffering. So they have to do something about it. It's a matter, now it's not a nice to have, now it's a survival.
Right. It's to your point. It's amazing that the last few months, going on a couple of years, that experience has driven more credible and solid change in organizations than our CIOs, our chief strategy officers, and the strategic plans that used to be the world that we were all a part of that would drive the change, right? And we were often, being a former chief strategy officer, you were always pulling up the hill about what could happen in the future. And what the last 2 years has completely inverted that, where, the things that we would say, imagine the unimaginable.
Yes.
Now it's happening and allowing us to drive our work. I'm just sort of curious as to how we now see the broader design profession being able to respond to this. As you said, there's a push on solving problems that were unsolvable, thinking of dynamic ways to work, building at a speed and with a technology assist that we hadn't seen before. Where do you think, and it's a big question, where do you think the future design is in that?
Yeah, well, I think, we're seeing the trend of the in-person experience changing a lot, kind of retail. I can't even remember the last time I stepped into a retail mall. So there's a lot more kind of online. So digital commerce, I think people are more comfortable now ordering, whether it's food, deliveries, groceries. So the demand for that is only going to increase. People are spending more time on screens more than ever. It's interesting. So here's an anecdote. Even just on my own podcast, I was surprised that a good percentage, it's almost like 50-50 in terms of people who listen. I think pre-pandemic, I think people might have listened to my podcast over on mobile but a good chunk of my listeners are listening on the desktop. Because why? Because people work from home in front of a computer. They're not mobile necessarily, right? They're sitting at work or at home. I think there's more consumption of like smart TVs are more ubiquitous now. And so digital experience will be not just on computer screens. Of course, mobile screens have been there forever, but also you're seeing screens on exercise equipment. So like the mirror or the Peloton bike or that hydro equipment where now you're seeing digital screens. So digital screens are more pervasive. So the opportunities for designers to design experiences are broadening beyond just mobile and the computer screen. And now with what we just mentioned in terms of companies trying to accelerate their digital transformation, I think the whole industry has also seen a shortage or a lack of enough talent and bandwidth to handle all these projects. So designers, any technical resource, whether it's designers or engineers, it's definitely a seller's market here. And we've also seen salaries rise and stuff. So it's great to be a designer or IT field right now because there's no shortage of opportunities. And I think it's also more egalitarian in the sense that if you're in a small town in the USA, even though you were talented, but if you weren't willing to move, Apple, Google, they weren't willing to, or Facebook, they weren't willing to hire you unless you moved to, say, Menlo Park or Cupertino or the Bay Area. And now you can.
We talked at the beginning to ask the question, where of the world are you leading from today? And so you gave me your answer, and it's really powerful. You talked about that of not having to be in the places that people expect. And you're joining me today from a very cold Chicago, right?
That's right.
So how has Chicago as an environment and a city really shaped your view of the world?
Well, Chicago has been very formative in my years as an early software engineer and their nascent tech startups. You know, Chicago has many examples of startups, including the developers of Basecamp, and that's like a source of pride for Chicago. The Chicago bootstrap startup. One of the co-founders is also the creator of the software development platform Ruby on Rails. So that's one example. In the consumer startup, in the early days, Threadless was this crowdsourced T-shirt company. So basically, the way it worked was they didn't come up with their own designs every so often. Every was it week or month, artists would submit their designs, and the crowd would upvote which designs they liked, and the winning designs would then get printed. So it always kind of ensured product market fit because the winning design would get printed, and then the designs that people didn't want, and then the artist would get a cut of this. So it was a win-win for everybody. Consumers got the designs, the t-shirts that they wanted. The artists got a cut for winning the design and getting, their stuff printed and made real. And then the company as a facilitator, as a platform, made money. So that was a great Chicago startup. And then, in more recent years, of course, companies like Groupon and many other companies like Trunk Club and many others have kind of shown that Chicago's been a great startup ecosystem as well.
So as we boldly go into our 2022 here, and we have listeners from all different backgrounds and all over the world that come in here. I want to ask you this, what advice do you have for engineers, coders, developers, entrepreneurs? And I listed a lot of names because in some ways in our world, it doesn't really matter. Those who are trying to make a difference through solving problems in this year, what advice do you have?
For me, I have a lot to thank for in terms of relationships. I think everything I've ever gotten was through relationships. So someone who knows someone, or, when people ask me how have I managed to get these clients? Number one answer is always relationships. How do I get on the IGA podcast? Relationships. It's all about relationships. So it's hard to go through, I think Arnold Schwarzenegger, during one of his commencement speeches, he talks about the myth of the self-made man. And there's no such thing because his success was built on the shoulders of giants. And likewise, my journey, Impekable, was not built just on my accomplishments. It's, the team's accomplishments and then the clients as well. So building relationships, curating relationships, that would be my advice, which is partly why I started the podcast as well, the design podcast, because in pre-pandemic times, it was easier to just grab coffee with someone. When that went away, or made way more inconvenient than having a podcast where it's an excuse to meet and talk to people and get to know them and spend time with them. I think that helped solve for that and helped me find a way to continue the creation and building of relationships.
Well, I can say for one, I'm looking forward to our coffee in Chicago once the weather breaks and we travel more.
Yes, I would love that.
I want to leave us today with one of the quotes that you highlighted that you tweeted a little while ago that just said, ordinary things done consistently create extraordinary results. And so entrepreneur, problem solver, innovator, UI, design, adjacent leader, thank you for joining me, my brother. I appreciate you sharing with us all today for Design Adjacent.
Oh, thank you for allowing me to spend time with your audience, Benny. I appreciate it very much.
I look forward to seeing and watching what you and Impekable are able to do as this new year goes forward, and encouraging all of us to build relationships, to work diligently and hard, and to not be afraid of these uncomfortable problems to solve.
Be comfortable with discomfort.
So thank you once again, and thank you all for joining us for this episode of Design Adjacent. I invite you to join us next time. We'll be talking about design and the world around us. Thank you.
Show notes for this episode will be available on aiga.org. Please subscribe to our show on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. AIGA's Design Adjacent podcast and its contents are the copyright of AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. All rights reserved. Any redistribution or reproduction of part or all of the content in any form is prohibited without AIGA's express written permission. My name is Li Shan Huang. Until next time.